It's not what you say to everyone else that determines your life. It's what you whisper to yourself that has the greatest power. Now, that is from Mac and Angel. Hello and welcome to Bishop World. My name is Umoholo Bikinini, the Bishop himself. And it's good to be back. I know this one took a while to make for very obvious reasons. The whole world has been in an apocalypse state. But yeah, what's the world without Bishop World? What's the world without our beautiful conversation? So today we're talking about an interesting title, like always, and it's Coping, the Art of Calm. Bishop, how do you cope? How do you remain calm? How are you able to walk through life with a sense of calm where, the world could be ending today. You just be there, having a cup of coffee. I'm not sure, but that's the questions usually that I get from people. So today I'm going to talk about coping. And it's a very relevant, title, given that we're in a period of time where you have to cope about a lot of things. So the fundamental question we're asking today is, how does one carry on living in a world that has spent billions of years perfecting its art of killing you? How do you smile in the face of adversity, cruelty, chaos, and the threat of mortality? We live in a world that is in many ways trying to harm us, in many ways brutal, in many ways hurting us, and all sorts of things. So how do you carry on living with that sense of positivity, of coping, or how do you recover after life has hit you so hard? And now to address that, I would say for us to understand coping, we first have to understand suffering itself, because I feel, for me personally, the key to my coping, or the key to coping, as I feel it should be, is understanding suffering. Because most of the reasons we suffer is because we don't understand what it is in the first place. So if we can contextualize it and talk about it, then from that an imagined coping mechanism comes from. So the first thing we're going to talk about is suffering. Understanding suffering is the first key coping mechanism. So let's talk about suffering. Why do you suffer? Most of the people I've dealt with have asked this question. Usually I would ask, what are you suffering from? And they go on listing all this, tragic events that, some of them are brutal, and a lot of people that have went through a lot of brutal things in life. And usually they give that list and say, this is why I'm suffering. These are the reasons for my suffering. Now, that is correct, but not entirely true. Because you see, events cause pain, but they don't cause suffering. I'm going to repeat that. Events cause pain, but they don't cause suffering. Now, what that means is, pain, that's one of the beautiful things said by one Buddhist, Haruki Murakami, if I remember very well. He said, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Because you see, you feel pain, but suffering is how you interpret the pain. It's what causes the long-term suffering is how you contextualize it. Because the normal routine is often when a tragic event happens, we map it out and save a representation of that feeling. And what happens is that we prolong and extend it and replay it through time. So an event happened 10 years ago. You're still suffering from it now. I'm not sure we can say you're suffering from the event. Because by definition, the event is no longer occurring. So suffering, it's not independent of the event, but it can happen even without the event. That's also one other thing about suffering. It's easy to make yourself suffer. We do it every day. You sit in your room and you can come up with the worst case scenario and suffer from it. That's one of the key things also you need to understand about suffering, is humans have these two beautiful faculties, the faculties of a vivid memory and having a vivid imagination. Now, these two things are one of the key important things about our minds, our ability to have very good memory and our ability to have a very good imagination. They're very good, but they're also the key to our suffering. Because a very vivid imagination means we can save and represent this tragic event in our past, and we can replay them at any point in our life and still suffer them. And a vivid imagination means we can construct possibilities of a future and suffer from it even when it has not happened. And half of the time it even happens with people's and relationships and everything. Your imaginations or your memories make you suffer. It's rarely events. I mean, events do happen, but what I want the takeaway from this is pain is caused by events. Events happen, we feel pain. That's justified. That's inevitable. That is natural. But your suffering, your prolonged experience of that pain is something that is in a way self-driven. I mean, that's even, I usually give the example of actors. Actors are able to cry because one thing you need to understand about emotions is something you can reconstruct. And during the research done on actors is when actors actually cry, they're not faking the cry. They're actually feeling the emotion. They construct it to get themselves to a point where they can cry. And you do that every time. Every time you feel something, you construct it. That's why you suffer from it for the next 10 years and never recover from it. Yeah, the event initiated it, but you propagated it. So how do I cope? How do you cope? You first need to understand that suffering is your own doing. From the first episode, I talked about it. The art of moving out of your own way. Defining yourself as the enemy. One of my mottos personally, one of the key things I've ever wrote, one of the key phrases I always repeat is my enemy is my enemy. That is how I profoundly contextualized my own life. The fact that most of my suffering it's not maybe by my making, but it's aided by my own psychology. It's aided by my own thoughts. And the second thing is, I usually say is you're not hurt because something happened. You are hurt because you think it shouldn't have happened. That's one of the key things to our suffering. Besides a vivid imagination and vivid everything, one of the keys of suffering is contextualization of events. The reason people suffer most of the time is not because something happened. It's because they thought it wasn't supposed to happen. And when it happens, they think it's unfair. Life is unfairly targeting them. It's unfairly treating them. Oh, sure, life unfairly treats us. But you want to know who life unfairly treats? Everyone. That means life is fair in that sense. I never understand people when they say life is unfair. Well, like if it's unfair to everyone, then that's fair. That's what fairness means. Treating everyone the same way. And since everyone is undergoing this brutality, I mean, yeah, we have different privileges. That's no question about that. But the fact that it's a random selection. Everybody who was there at that moment was doomed. I mean, when something hit Earth right now, it hits everyone. Global warming is going to happen for everyone. Nature happens to everyone. Life, death, whatever. So that's how fair life is. But the reason people suffer is they have this context in their mind that the event happened because in some sense their life is unfair. Their life is brutal. It's not like everyone else's life. Why me? Why my mom? Why now? Why? I'm like, yeah, that's a very valid question to ask because you're feeling pain. But once you keep asking that for the next 10 years, it means you're going to suffer that event for eternity because you refuse to accept that event as a normal part of your existence as somebody taking place in this brutal game called life. How do I cope? It's because I accept that the moment I accepted to take part in this whole thing, then I was bound to go through things. I'm bound for things to happen to me. I'm bound to accept it when they happen because by accepting life, I'm accepting what life is. And life is brutality, like by no question. I don't think you can question that, which is why if you look look through like the mythology, the literature, we always represent life as this brutal game. And not only do we represent it that way, I mean, if you look through all the great stories, the great story is man goes through all suffering, but at the end he triumphs all this and he makes it through it. I feel like that's the best contextualization of life to cope, is life is making it through the worst but coming out victorious. Like the greatest story, your greatest movie you've always loved. One of the key to great writing a life story is, I mean, you don't want to watch a movie or read a book where it's all happy to the end. Like where's the life in that? The life is in the brutality, that adversity that somebody withstands and emerges victorious. That's the key coping mechanism, understanding that life is that process. I mean, one of the best, for example, when you're going to write a story, let's say an action movie, one of the key things they do is the star there in the movie, like let's say usually the last fight scene, it's not something he just, wins like easily, moves over his enemy. He's usually first portrayed as somebody who's broken down to the core. Usually they pass out or faint or whatever. And at that moment, flashes of imagination, of events, of the purpose. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about. One of the key coping mechanisms is purpose. Once they remember the purpose of why they are fighting, it's almost like they get reborn. It's like a new fight, just erupts out of them. So that's the second thing. After you understand suffering, the second key coping mechanism to move on is purpose. Once you have a purpose, like that's why they say anybody who has a why can withstand any how. It's that thing that when you're knocked down and on the ground and have passed out, it flashes in your mind. It just says, you're not going to stay down. You got to stand up. We're going to fight. It's not done yet. So that's one of the things. And usually people, when you talk to people, they don't want to define their life, because look, this is what happens when you have a purpose, a sense of purpose or goal. Goal is more of one of the words I like, because purpose usually is very generalized, but goal is very specific. You set a goal. Once you have a goal to reach, you orient your life around it. And usually that comes with responsibility. And one of the reasons people don't want to set goals or have a sense of purpose is because they don't want that responsibility. Like, well, if you don't have that, it means you're also very vulnerable to the brutality of life, because you lack one of the key ingredients to suffering. I mean, one of the reasons people withstand suffering is because there's a goal which they believe is worth it. Once you don't have that, then your life is all vague. You're just in existence and going through suffering that has no worth. That's why a lot of, people who are like, for example, in the teenage years, everything causes adversity, everything causes breakdown, because, they look at life as this thing that owes them a certain sense of happiness. Mistake number 3. Like I talked about not understanding suffering and not having a purpose. So the coping mechanism there is understand why you suffer, and it's not because of events. It's how you contextualize them. It's how you take them and, extend them through time with your memory and project them into your future with your imagination, and sit down and suffer and cry and picture all the worst things that could happen and suffer from that and be anxious about the future and all that. That's the key to your suffering. Therefore, understanding that on its own has an emergent coping strategy, because you can notice when you're doing this. You can notice when it's you running the simulations. You can notice it puts you in a better chance to cope with a situation, because you don't suffer from yourself. It's the second key thing. Have a purpose. When you have a purpose, it means you can bear the brutality of life, because there's a worth goal that you are to reach, or there's a worth purpose with which you orient yourself around, which makes the pain or whatever, everything that comes bearable, because there's something bigger than your own existence. That's what purpose is. defining something that is bigger than you. Therefore, whatever you go through cannot be allowed to jeopardize the purpose itself. And you accept things that go through you as long as you're moving forward to the purpose, because the purpose by definition is bigger than you are. It's not about you. It's about achieving the purpose. The third thing about coping, the third thing that people need to understand is the idea of usually I term it to child growth, like our childhood. Like, how well prepared are you for life? One of the best coping mechanisms is being well prepared for life, approaching life with a sense of awareness that life is brutal. One of the key mistakes you can make, and we make this every time when we raise our children, is that we tell them life is this thing that is about happiness, that owes them a sense of happiness, and they have to be happy, and they deserve to be accepted. We usually make them entitled to things. You're entitled to being accepted. You're entitled to being respected and all that. Guess what? That's not how life plays out. Which is why when a lot of children grow up, when they reach the young adult age, usually maybe after when they go to university or usually after graduation, when now the full extent of life is exposed to them, they realize it's nothing they were promised. It's nothing they ever imagined. So life catches them on surprise. And one of the worst fights you can go through in your life is a fight that happened in surprise mode, because you're not ready to defend yourself. And you fall harder because of that. And it's very difficult for them to cope because they envisioned a different life growing up. So the best thing you can do for your children is teach them life is a brutal game. It's difficult. You're going to have to work hard. You're going to have the times people will spit on you, the times people won't respect you. I mean, one of the key things I grew up with, I was raised by very strong women, like my aunt, my grandma, my mother in particular. One thing about her, I never really understood what purpose it served until I grew up. She used to do something that would annoy me at one point. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but imagine living with a mom who constantly reminds you that they might die any day. Like everything, it could be the simplest thing. She always had a good way of bringing it into the conversation. Like when I have to do something and I say, I can't do it. And then you say, well, what will you do if I die? What if I'm not here by tomorrow? So every time she got the chance, she would say it. She would remind me that life is brutal. You gotta know how to do things. You gotta know how to cope. You gotta depend on yourself. That's why I grew up with this independent person who can, goes out there in the world and does stuff. Because I lived with a mom who constantly reminded me she'll not always be there to do things for me. Even when she could. There was what I usually call a positive negligence. Even things that she could, she would give me she would deprive me of some things just to expose me to the reality of fabric of life. And that's one of the things we do usually in psychology when you're dealing with psychological disorders or people who suffering from phobias. You expose them. That's I think that'll be the fourth coping mechanism. Expose yourself to life. Expose your children to the brutality of life, or at least the reality of it. The reality or the possibility that life could be brutal. They have to be aware of that. Because if it doesn't, then life will catch them off guard. And usually they don't cope. Usually, the coping mechanism. That's why, people talk of drug usage, depression in youth and all that. These are people who can't withstand the reality of life, that life is not always going to go your way. I mean, I remember having a conversation with one of my friends. I talked to a lot of people. I helped them go through a lot of stuff. And one of the key things talked about, she's saying, oh, life is not going my way. And I remember I said to one of them, I said, well, I'm glad it is not going your way. What about my way? And what about his way? What about somebody else's way? See, that's the greatest thing about life. It's not going in anybody's way. It's a little bit your way today. It's a little bit my way tomorrow. And that's how fate is. It's not your way throughout. If it's your way throughout, then it would be unfair. So today will be your day, the next week something bad will happen. That's the reality of a life. So you cope by accepting it. You cope by accepting that pain or events happen and they cause pain, and you don't have to feel you're unfairly treated. It happens to everybody. I mean, one of the key observations I've made usually when I talk to a lot of people, especially when it's a group of friends, when they're talking about, let's say, an experience, a bad experience, a tragic experience, one of the things that everybody does is they try to outperform the other by stating their event as more brutal. Like when you say something, and like, that's nothing. You should hear my story. And then the other guy will be like, both of you combined don't come close to mine. So there's a certain sense of pride in going through the worst. It's a very strange form of pride. I've noticed it with everybody. Everybody takes pride in, surviving the worst thing. That's where meaning of life comes from. That's where coping comes from. You recognizing that bad things have happened. I mean, usually they don't say it from that perspective, but usually it gets me thinking that these people know of the worst they have survived, and usually the problem with that is everybody wants to define themselves as the most suffering. Now, once you contextualize life in that matter, that's where usually the idea of life is unfair comes from. Why me? The questions like that come from. It's because you consider yourself unfairly targeted by life. I'm like, get over yourself. You're not that important. That life is out there, looking for you. Life was here first. You found it here. So if anything, it doesn't owe you anything. Life doesn't have issues with you. You have issues with life. It was here first. So people need to understand that. So when things happen, whatever life does, it doesn't owe you. It's you who has to orient yourself around the reality of life. That's how I cope. I understand that things will happen. And when things happen, they'll be painful, brutal. I lost my father at one point. It was painful, but I remember everybody else was crying, but I was that kid. Part of the many reasons to that, and I was able to cope with that, and I didn't let it. I loved my father so much, but I was able to take that because my father also kind of had the same mentality, which he taught me, the idea of accepting brutality as part of life. And once you have that, you have one of the best coping mechanisms. And what you want to do is, after you accept that events happen and pain and whatever, after that, what you do is you expose yourself. You expose your children. You expose yourself to the reality of life, at least to a certain extent. That's why if you read almost every great story of people who coped or who managed, it's people who had this brutal background. Those are people who went through the worst, if I may put it that way. People, usually they'll tell you, I was homeless at one point. I was abused. I went through this. So that exposed them to the brutality of life. It can turn out two ways. Usually some people can take that and they go through life with a vengeful and resentful perspective to life. But people who are able to contextualize that better are able to use it to propel themselves to greater things. Because there's nothing else you can do to that person. They've been exposed to enough. What's the worst you can do to a homeless man who's been spat on and who's went to bed hungry? You can't do anything. You become unstoppable in a sense. The brutality of life comes hardwired in you that a no or a rejection or a simple gesture, you don't care, fill up a room, a simple remark can't move you. I've been homeless for this long. How are you going to move me with a remark? How are you going to move me with a simple thing? So your level of exposure gives you a certain edge. There's a lot you can take. And that's better than coping also, I think. Coping usually is, you're trying to deal with things. But that gives you a certain sense of immunity, in a sense. You are immune to falling over the edge. And that's the best coping strategy according to me. You don't want to fall over the edge and want to come back up, the first thing you want to do is being immovable in a way. I mean, there are drastic things that will hit you to the core. But once you have that level of exposure to reality, you are able to take it better than somebody who is protected their whole life. So that's why people can't cope with a lot of things. So how do you cope? I'll keep repeating this whole process. Understand what suffering is. Understand that your events don't cause pain. No, they don't cause suffering, rather. They cause pain, but you don't suffer because of that pain. You suffer because you prolong it through time. You have good imagination, good memory. You play it along. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. I mean, we do it every time. Sometimes be like, how do I stop it? Well, now that's where usually, a lot of psychological concepts come in, which we can explore later on. But that's very important, to define your suffering as something that is in your control because you propagate it in the first place. Pain is not in your control. Brutality of life is not in your control. But your suffering is. For you to cope, you first have to accept that. One of the ways to cope is you have to expose yourself to that brutality, willingly, in a sense. That's what makes these great heroes in stories. These are people who willingly walk to trouble and expose themselves as much as they can. And once you survive once or twice, you realize I'm this thing that can survive the threat of death, the threat of life. I can stand it. I can go into a cave and work out. And it gives you a sense of, having an immovable spirit, calm, the art of calm, I usually call it. The ability for adversity and brutality to go on and you still remain calm because, you've made it out before. That's why people be like, you always go up on stage. I've been doing public speaking for a very long time. You go up there with this sense of calm and, it's almost as if you're unshaken and you're not scared. I'm like, you don't understand. I'm still nervous. I'm still shit. I still feel whatever I felt before. But once you do it a couple of times, you survived it. What's the worst that could happen? I've stood before 1,000 crowds. Like, yeah, today could be a bad day, but it's this thing. Exposure is one of the best way to cope. You have to know life is a brutal game. Now, one other important coping mechanism, I talked also about purpose, don't forget. One other thing also is helping other people. Now, how does this help you? It doesn't help you directly, but maybe it's just a personal thing to me. Every time I've went through something, I know at least one person who has went through worse. It's almost, it gives you a sense of gratefulness towards life. I'm grateful that things could have been worse, but they aren't. I know somebody who's went through, I've dealt with all sorts of problems. People who are suicidal problems, people who are abused, people with anger problems. I've dealt with all sorts of people. People, have opened up to me with some of the most brutal stories. And usually, sometimes I'm humble how people approach me and say, I've never told this to anyone. You're the first person. And that's a very humbling thing. And to say somebody has, usually, sometimes it's even strangers, which it's more interesting and also puzzling. So the more you get these people, you realize people are walking around with, some of the most brutal stories you could imagine, and they've survived that, and they're still walking. That's what amazes me. Humans have this power to transcend and withstand things. And if only they understood that, about everyone, that it's not only them, everyone else you see walking around has made it through something, therefore you can. That's like a lifetime coping mechanism there. You can knock me down, but I know somebody who's recovered from something worse, then this is nothing. I can take it. So, yeah, I would love to explore this topic, further in detail also and extend it in the next episodes. And, it's a beautiful thing to explore. And also, maybe I should take this time. My time's running out. I just saw the alarm there. One other thing, just a quick appreciation post. As you know, we're going through this COVID-19 pandemic. Just a quick appreciation to all those, medical experts, all those personnel who are in the front lines of this thing. I mean, thus talking about coping. If you think, I was talking to a friend of mine, it's like, it sucks that we be working from home. They say, everybody says stay home, and I say something. I say, you want to know who's not working from home? It's the doctors that are out there trying to treat patients, and some of them are dying from this thing. So you have to be grateful to a certain extent that you only get to lock yourself up safe in a room and be away from the virus. Somebody's not home and is not working from home. He's working in the front line. So I feel like those people are heroes, and they deserve all the appreciation they can get. You can help them by taking all the necessary precautions, stay safe, do everything you can, protect your loved ones, children, everybody, to stay safe. This whole thing will go away, but we have to put effort into that. Faith usually is a very good thing once paired with a very good level of work and effort. It's when you do everything you can and live the rest that you can't to hope. And hope is what you want to be true, knowing you're not entirely in control. Thank you for joining me, folks. And we'll meet up next time. I love you all. I mean, it's been also very difficult to make up an episode during this whole transition and everything that was going on. But yeah, managed to pull something up, and I'll settle in with time and we can resume normal schedule. And yeah, welcome to Bishop World. Enjoy your day.